The Young and the Restless spoilers. Mariah Copeland's latest remark doesn't land like a throwaway line or a bit of heightened melodrama that the audience will forget by next week. It lands like the kind of vow that soap operas use as a hidden fuse, the kind that sits quietly under the story until the moment it detonates. When The Young and the Restless has a character declare that they would rather die than let someone take their child, the show is rarely offering an empty emotional flourish. It is telegraphing a psychological point of no return, especially when that character is someone whose mental health has been under sustained pressure for a long time and whose identity, sense of safety, and concept of family have already been repeatedly tested. Mariah swearing she would rather die than let anyone steal Dominic Newman Abbott Winter's chancellor away from her is not only a statement of devotion, it is a statement of possession, desperation, and distorted reality, and the most unsettling part is that it fits too neatly into what her current spiral has been building toward. Mariah's history has never been a straight line of stability. Her story has often lived in the aftermath of trauma, in the way fear can masquerade as love, and in the way a mind under extreme stress can rewrite facts into something emotionally survivable. That is why her fixation on Dominic, and her insistence, conscious or subconscious, that he is her son, becomes so dangerous once she is pushed into a fugitive state. Running changes everything. Running turns a frightened person into a cornered person, and a cornered person will do things that contradict the self they used to recognize. On paper, Mariah knows the truth. Dominic is the child she carried as a surrogate, a baby she helped bring into the world for the family she loves, a child she has been allowed to adore but not claim in the legal, biological, or traditional sense. But The Young and the Restless is not a show that treats truth as merely factual, it treats truth as emotional, and emotional truth is where the real conflict lives. When mental health deteriorates, facts can become optional while feelings become absolute. Mariah's long-term struggles make it believable that, under the weight of fear and perceived betrayal, her mind has begun to reshape the story of Dominic into something that answers her deepest terror: abandonment, replacement, invisibility. The idea that the love she has poured into this child could be erased with a single decision by people with more power, more legitimacy, more last names. Dominic's very name, layered with Newman and Abbott and Winters and Chancellor, becomes symbolic in a way that is both poetic and cruel because it reminds Mariah that he is connected to dynasties and legacies that she can never fully outrank. That kind of insecurity, when mixed with instability, can turn protective love into a claim of ownership, and once the claim becomes "I would rather die," the story isn't just about custody or kidnapping anymore. It becomes about martyrdom, about the willingness to turn the self into collateral damage, about a character who has decided that death is preferable to returning to a world where she feels powerless. Mariah being on the run with Dominic is the kind of setup that practically begs for a major event, because it forces every clock in the narrative to start ticking at once. The police clock, the family clock, the psychological clock, the moral clock. Every mile Mariah travels increases the danger not just of being caught, but of making a mistake, of panicking, of misreading a situation and acting impulsively, of turning a rescue into a tragedy. And because soap storytelling thrives on escalation, the question becomes not whether something big will happen, but what form that big takes. And whether the show is preparing the audience for the possibility that Mariah may not survive this arc. The language surrounding her vow, the tone of inevitability in the way the plot is framed, the sense that she is heading toward a confrontation rather than toward surrender, all of it makes the prospect of her death feel disturbingly plausible. In many kidnapping arcs, the kidnapper eventually collapses into remorse or is subdued and arrested, and the child is recovered with minimal harm. But when the kidnapper is also a long-established character whose mental state is central to the tragedy, the show sometimes chooses a different, sharper ending. A final moment that is not about evil being punished, but about a broken person reaching the end of their endurance. A car accident is one obvious route, because it allows the story to be both shocking and accidental, a fate rather than a sentence. Something that can be mourned without having to fully litigate intention. It also fits a runaway storyline neatly. A crash can happen during a frantic escape, a wrong turn, a moment of distraction, a slippery road, a panicked attempt to outrun a cruiser. In that scenario, Dominic can be found and saved, perhaps shaken but physically unharmed, while Mariah's injuries become catastrophic, turning her vow into prophecy. The tragedy is magnified because it feels like the universe punishing her not for loving Dominic, but for being unable to live with the fear of losing him. The other route, Mariah being shot by police in a tense confrontation, carries an even darker kind of dramatic logic. It transforms the story from a woman in crisis makes a terrible choice into a town fails to recognize the difference between threat and illness until it is too late. It forces the audience to sit with the moral ugliness of a standoff where everyone believes they are protecting a child, yet the outcome is irreversible. Imagine the scene as the show would stage it: flashing lights in the distance, the cold geometry of a blocked road or a secluded hideout, Mariah holding Dominic too tightly. Not because she wants to harm him, but because letting go feels like a death anyway. The police shouting commands, Mariah hearing only fragments, her brain translating them into a single message: they are coming to take him. In that kind of heightened mental state, any sudden movement can be misinterpreted, any step forward can be read as aggression, any flinch can trigger tragedy. If a gun goes off, whether through panic or miscalculation, the show gets its shock, and it also gets a long, agonizing aftermath where characters are forced to ask what they could have done differently. In that aftermath, the narrative can still insist that Dominic is rescued without lasting physical harm, because the real wound becomes psychological. The horror of being the baby at the center of a catastrophe, the child whose life becomes a symbol of loss for everyone around him. If Mariah dies in this storyline, the fallout is not contained to one grief arc. It ricochets through multiple families and exposes fault lines that were already there. The first and most immediate consequence is that Dominic becomes the most complicated kind of saved character alive, unharmed, yet forever marked by the story that surrounded his rescue. The people who love him will not simply rejoice, they will be haunted. They will replay every decision, every warning sign they missed, every time they assumed Mariah was coping because she was smiling, every moment they thought love would be enough to keep her stable. They will also have to reckon with the uncomfortable question that Mariah's vow raises: did they ever truly understand how deeply she felt bonded to Dominic? And did they unintentionally dismiss that bond because she was only the surrogate? This is where the show can sharpen the tragedy into something more painful than a standard death. It becomes an indictment of how easily people reduce a surrogate's role to biology and contracts, ignoring the emotional reality that carrying a child can carve into a person's identity. Even if everyone intellectually knows Dominic is not hers, the story can argue that Mariah's heart never accepted that boundary, and that boundary is exactly what broke her. The idea that Dominic could survive even the most catastrophic outcome because Chance Chancellor has been framed as his unseen guardian adds an almost mythic layer to a storyline that is already drenched in tragedy. And The Young and the Restless has a long history of leaning into exactly this kind of symbolic storytelling when it wants an arc to resonate beyond plot mechanics. Even if Mariah and Dominic were to be involved in a car accident, the deliberate invocation of Chance's name as Dominic's protector feels far too intentional to ignore. As though the show is quietly preparing the audience to accept that the child will emerge unscathed no matter how dark the road becomes. Chance, long established as a figure of quiet strength and moral gravity, carries with him the emotional weight of sacrifice and unfinished life. And positioning him as a guardian angel figure allows the narrative to bridge the physical and emotional realms without explicitly crossing into fantasy. Soap operas rarely show something without purpose, and the decision to include scenes of Dominic seemingly sensing his father through dreams or visions is not incidental filler. It is narrative scaffolding. It asks the audience to consider that Chance's presence, though no longer corporeal, still exerts influence, especially when it comes to protecting the most innocent life tied to his legacy. If Dominic sees Chance in a dream, if the show lingers on that image, then it becomes an unspoken promise that whatever danger lies ahead, Chance will not allow his son to be taken. The dream is not about grief alone, it is about reassurance, about destiny, about a protective force that operates when adults fail. This interpretation becomes even more compelling when placed alongside Mariah's increasing absence from the screen. In daytime storytelling, reduced visibility is often a warning sign, not necessarily because a character is being forgotten, but because their story is being concentrated, compressed, and prepared for a decisive turn. Mariah's arc has been stripped down to its most volatile components: her deteriorating mental health, her fixation on Dominic, her isolation, and now the collapse of the relationship that once anchored her. With her romance with Tessa Porter effectively over and Tessa beginning a new chapter with Daniel Romalotti, Mariah is left untethered in a way that feels deliberate. The show is not giving her a soft landing or a gradual transition, it is removing support systems one by one. That kind of narrative pruning rarely leads to a quiet exit. Instead, it often signals a shock departure, something abrupt and emotionally violent that leaves a scar on the canvas rather than a sense of closure. If Mariah's storyline ends in tragedy, the contrast between Dominic's safety and her demise becomes the cruelest possible irony. And that irony is exactly what soaps use when they want an ending to feel both meaningful and unbearable. Chance as a guardian from beyond the grave allows the writers to save the child without diminishing the stakes. Dominic can survive a crash, chase, or a confrontation not because the danger was exaggerated, but because someone unseen intervened. In that framework, Mariah's death does not feel random. It feels like the final act of a story that has been steering her towards self-destruct under the guise of protection. She becomes the one who cannot be saved, even as the child she was desperate to keep safe is preserved by forces beyond her control. The presence of Chance's ghost, whether literal or symbolic, reframes the entire kidnapping arc as something closer to fate than crime, a tragic convergence of love, illness, and legacy rather than a simple act of villainy. The emotional fallout of such an ending would be devastating, particularly for Sharon Newman, whose history makes this scenario almost unbearably cruel. Sharon has already lived through the loss of Cassie Newman, a wound that never truly healed and that continues to define her emotional landscape decades later. The possibility that Mariah, Cassie's twin, could also die is not just another loss, it is the collapse of an entire emotional structure Sharon has spent years trying to rebuild. Losing Mariah would mean losing the daughter she only recently reconnected with in a meaningful way, the daughter who represented redemption, second chances, and the idea that some broken stories can be mended if given enough time. To then face the reality that both of her twin daughters are gone would not simply push Sharon into grief, it would shatter her sense of narrative justice. It would raise the unbearable question of why her family, again and again, is asked to pay the highest possible price. This kind of devastation would almost certainly send Sharon into a psychological tailspin, especially given the broader context of her life at this moment. She is already emotionally vulnerable, pulled back toward Nick Newman while he himself is unraveling under the weight of addiction. If Mariah dies during this period of instability, Sharon's grief would not exist in a vacuum. It would collide with Nick's self-destructs, amplifying everything. Sharon might blame herself for missing signs, for not intervening sooner, for being distracted, for trusting that Mariah's love for Dominic would somehow be enough to keep her grounded. She might also turn her anger outward, resenting the system, the police, the family dynamics that left Mariah feeling cornered, and even the memory of Chance himself for being able to protect Dominic but not the woman who carried him. In classic The Young and the Restless fashion, that grief would not be neat or noble. It would be messy, volatile, and potentially destructive, opening the door to relapses, estrangements, and choices Sharon will later regret. Tessa's reaction, while quieter on the surface, would be no less profound. Even though her relationship with Mariah has ended and she has begun something new with Daniel, that does not erase the depth of what she and Mariah shared. If Mariah dies, Tessa is left carrying the complicated burden of unfinished love, and resolved resentment, and the guilt that comes with moving on too soon. Even if intellectually she knows she had every right to do so. Soap operas excel at exploring this kind of emotional contradiction, where characters mourn someone they were no longer with, and where grief is laced with self-accusation for words left unsaid and doors closed too quickly. Tessa might replay every argument, every moment she chose distance over confrontation, wondering whether staying, insisting, or fighting harder could have altered the outcome. Her relationship with Daniel would be immediately shadowed by this loss, not because Daniel is responsible, but because new beginnings feel almost obscene in the wake of such a tragedy. Happiness becomes something to apologize for rather than celebrate. From a structural standpoint, the idea that Dominic is protected by Chance's presence allows the show to preserve hope in one corner of the canvas even as it devastates another. Dominic's survival ensures that Chance's legacy continues, that his name and values are not erased by death. It also provides a moral counterweight to Mariah's demise, suggesting that love does not fail entirely, even when it takes a catastrophic form. The child lives, the lineage endures, and yet the cost is unbearable. That balance between preservation and loss is exactly where The Young and the Restless often finds its most enduring stories. It is not about giving the audience what it wants, but about giving it something that lingers, something that continues to inform character choices long after the immediate crisis has passed. The symbolism of Dominic seeing Chance in a dream, then, becomes more than just a touching moment. It becomes a thesis statement. It tells the audience that some bonds transcend death, that protection does not always look like prevention, and that survival sometimes comes at the expense of those who love the hardest. If Chance's ghost ensures Dominic's safety, then Mariah's vow to die rather than lose him takes on a tragic inevitability. She does not lose him in the way she feared, but she loses herself, and ultimately her life, because she could not imagine an identity that did not revolve around him. That is the cruel poetry of the arc, and it is exactly the kind of storytelling that justifies a shock exit rather than a quiet fade. In the end, if Mariah leaves the show in this way, her absence will not feel like a gap that can be easily filled. It will feel like a wound that reshapes the emotional geography of Genoa City. Sharon will carry the double loss of her twin daughters like a private apocalypse, a reminder that some families are marked by repetition, by patterns of grief that no amount of resilience can fully undo. Dominic will grow up surrounded by love, yet haunted by a story he will one day learn about the woman who loved him so fiercely that she could not survive the fear of letting him go. And Chance, hovering at the edges of memory and dream, will remain the silent figure who protected his son when no one else could, even if that protection came at a cost that the living will spend years trying to understand.